Cassandra's laughter at Rome's Hotel de Russie first carried the telltale sheen. Bright, brittle, cultivated to cut without leaving visible marks. It was the sort of social knife that glides across silk and leaves the gown intact while the wearer bleeds beneath it. And the remark, "Elliot doesn't really know how to struggle," sounded like a kiss until it dried into contempt by morning, which is how malice travels in high rooms with better views than hearts. It arrives charming and leaves accurate. She belonged to that floating nation of high society where talent is a club credential, beauty is currency until it matures into leverage, and the quickest way to be remembered is to be impossible to forget. Even Eleanor Van Doren, grandmother and sovereign of our family's holdings, had classified Cassandra not as friend or foe, but as a volatile asset whose price soared in public and crashed in private. The kind brokerages warn about in footnotes where lawsuits begin. The Van Doren Foundation Gala became my coronation as executor-in-waiting of a legacy Eleanor had carved from austerity and arithmetic. A $3 million pledge for rare pediatric disease work. A curation of artifacts and auction, lots with provenance that read like old money's rosary. And a seating chart engineered to minimize grudges and maximize checks. Which is to say, it was a battlefield with flowers and better wine. Cassandra chose scarlet for her entrance, an Oscar de la Renta that photographed like danger and moved like an oath. And the city made way for us because New York always does for a spectacle that might yield a headline. But a spectacle works both ways, and when the evening turned, it turned publicly because nothing is private where chandeliers are involved, and everyone's face glows with phones pretending to be mirrors. She told them I was sentimental, that I brought my grandmother flowers as if it could reverse time's litigations. And she told them that my charities were rehearsals for adulthood I had not yet passed. What cut was not the inaccuracy but the exactness with which she positioned the blade. Because contempt from a stranger is a comment while contempt from a lover is an indictment. And the room heard the indictment while pretending to admire the quartet's final cadence. In high society, sympathy is a luxury commodity traded only between equals, and what Cassandra misread as complicity in that circle of wives with colder diamonds was merely the weather pattern before a storm. Eleanor had once taught me that reputations are insured by conduct, and conduct in public settles accounts faster than press releases. So when I stepped to Cassandra's shoulder and agreed with her calmly, it wasn't surrender. It was accounting in the language the room understood. We withdrew the pledge, not from medicine but from the optics Cassandra had spoiled, and the silence that followed tasted metallic like a coin held too long in the mouth. Money speaks in two dialects, benevolence and boundary. And that night I changed languages mid-sentence as gently as a surgeon swaps instruments when blood appears from the wrong artery. I kissed her cheek, felt the tremor of panic beneath cosmetics that cost more than rent anywhere sane, and led my disgrace down the plaza's stair in dress shoes too quiet for exits this decisive. Then I drove to Eleanor's house by the sea where reputations rest and witnesses don't come unless subpoenaed by love or memory. Eleanor did not ask what was said. She asked what I learned, which is older and less kind. Knowledge is the tax maturity collects on illusions, and by the fire she told me what she already knew, that Cassandra had been gambling with credit in my name, that signatures had appeared where my hand had not, that the sheen of her life had been rented with interest and the interest had come due. Private investigators are not romantic until they save a fortune from being siphoned by one. I slept without sleeping, woke to the calculus betrayal demands, and made the sort of calls that end relationships and begin records. Accounts frozen, cards dead, locks changed, devices audited. Grief is a ceremony, and this was its administrative service. The hymns are passwords and the flowers are shredded applications, and when the phones began to ring and ring, their music had only two notes, panic and denial. By afternoon, the doorman tried courage and failed courtesy when Cassandra arrived to retrieve her future from my past. I paid movers to reconcile inventory with dignity, because one should never fight in the lobby even if the story demands boxing gloves. And in the evening on the porch with the Atlantic in litigant mood, Eleanor and I drank tea like pennants, while the private investigator tallied thefts small enough to be habitual and personal enough to be unforgivable. The next morning, social media did what it always does, convert complaint into theater and theater into a campaign. And Cassandra published an allegation with filters soft enough to blur responsibility and strong enough to sharpen a narrative of financial abuse. But high society reads receipts, not captions, and the comments migrated from sympathy to discovery when gambling photographs, bragging texts, and arithmetic made of screenshots began to replace adjectives. It turned quickly because the truth always does when it comes wearing numbers. The first day after the gala, panic called 12 times from Cassandra's voice, then 15 from her mother's, and finally twice from a number that belonged to a firm that spells its name with Latin, because Latin suggests the sort of gravity judges wear. Declining calls is not silence, it is choreography. One lets desperation measure itself against voicemail until desperation becomes admissible. Eleanor believed discipline is love with foresight, so we let the weekend sit cold and Monday arrived with surprise only for those who had not been paying attention. The audits from cybersecurity mapped the credit cemetery: 6 cards, 3 loans, a line of credit claimed from a bank that should have known better, and a signature that looked like mine the way a mask looks like a face in a dim room. Fraud is a confidence trick 2 parties perform. One signs, the other chooses not to see. Cassandra's entrance at the apartment's lobby would have been theatrical if it were not pathetic. The key that used to say yes now said no, and the doorman who used to be invisible became a wall. She mouthed the word mistake as if it had legal weight, and then filmed herself for evidence of cruelty. But cruelty is an action and boundary is a value, and cameras are poor judges without the documents that ruin a lie with nouns. By twilight, movers sealed her couture into crates that looked like coffins for gowns and her letters into boxes that felt dirtier than the dresses. Love does not end with screaming. It ends with inventory, and grief is logistics that carry away furniture no one photographs again. Eleanor signed for the last crate herself with the sort of firmness that retires eras and inaugurates health. Tuesday, Cassandra launched the one-attack modernity guarantees everyone, a story pinned to an audience that thinks sharing is activism. She named me controlling, accused me of cultivating dependency, and described our history like a fairy tale told backward where the prince locks towers and the witch is misunderstood. Narratives with villains sell quickly in circles that cannot bear complicity. But beneath the varnish, the arithmetic stood up and spoke. The wives who heard her laugh at the gala began to comment without kindness, screenshots of casino check-ins, recollections of poker nights in penthouses where the buy-in was paid with borrowed dignity, memories of whispered boasts about forging signatures as if it were clever and not criminal. Glamour collapses when its audience refuses to clap, and the clapback, as the young call it, became a discovery phase. The shares reversed like a tide embarrassed to have gone so far up the sand. By noon, the story had turned from victimhood to audit, and by evening, friends were subtracting themselves in private messages because scandal is contagious, and interior designers hate contagion. Cassandra tried apologies in a key that echoed, then explanations in a tone that fractured, then threats because exhaustion always becomes cruelty when manipulation fails. The thing about reputation in New York is that no one forgives you until the next scandal arrives with better lighting. Hers was lit harshly and suddenly. Her mother called to convene peace under the chandeliers of Park Avenue because some people think civility is absolution. I agreed to dinner and arrived with evidence because reason needs paper, not charm, timestamps, statements, footage with colors so unambiguous even denial's most devout worshippers lost their hymns. When I placed the casino still on the table and said the word Philadelphia, Cassandra lost color as if she had been drained, which, in a sense, is what fraud does when confronted with the bill. She tried a strategy the guilty have perfected into ritual. I am ill, help me heal, Forgive me now so I can learn later. Addiction is real and deserves care, but treatment is not the same as absolution and confession is not the same as restitution. Eleanor once told me mercy without memory becomes a policy, and policies attract abusers like galas attract photographers. I offered treatment recommendations, not access. The next morning, the letter arrived with letterhead so expensive it pretends to be argument. A claim of common law rights in a state that does not recognize them. A theory of de facto partnership, where contracts had already said the opposite. A recitation of dependence delivered by people who had insisted, repeatedly, on independence whenever accountability knocked. Lawyers turned a romance into a balance sheet and still lost the sum. Security footage caught the thing that ends patience. A visit to the apartment engineered with a doorman's trust and a story about retrieving heirlooms, an exit heavier than the entrance. A safe opened with a combination she had learned not through closeness but through surveillance. Eleanor's diamond bracelet, rescued decades ago from a marriage that ended with dignity, vanished into a pawn of desperation that felt less like theft and more like a confession that love had never been present, only proximity. Our attorney filed papers that recalibrated the conversation from feelings to felonies. Detectives with voices like uncarpeted hallways began speaking of counts and codes and surveillance beyond ours. Bank lobbies that remembered her face better than she remembered which lie had been told to whom. The case expanded because frauds are seldom singular, they cascade. Within days, the map of her work looked like a game played by someone who believes the house cannot win because the house is in love with her. Eleanor taught me that grief must pass through work or it grows thorns. So I went to the hospital on Tuesday to read in the cardiac wing. We funded quietly so machines could speak more loudly than donors. There I met Dr. Noor Calder, sleeves pushed, hair gathered as if time were a luxury she refused to buy, and eyes that chose facts first without being unkind. She thanked our foundation for equipment by naming outcomes, not by praising the size of checks, which is how sincere people translate gratitude. Nor did not flinch when I mentioned Cassandra. She had seen worse, children harmed by the arithmetic of adults who gambled with rent money, marriages folded by casinos that call themselves resorts, where Cassandra performed suffering for click-through redemption, nor did triage on consequences that didn't fit on screens. We spoke of boundaries as care, of love as a verb that prefers verbs like show and do, not perform and claim. Eleanor met Noor the following Sunday when I brought flowers because rituals remain even when narratives molt. Noor treated Eleanor not as a donor, but as a patient recovering her language from a stroke that had tried to tax her syllables. Eleanor admired Noor's seriousness, the way old architects admire a building that chooses integrity over novelty. She looked at me as Noor adjusted a pillow and raised one eyebrow, which in Eleanor's dialect means, "This one is built." While the legal machinery hardened into shape, Cassandra reinvented crisis into sabotage. Anonymous calls to the hospital requesting Noor for emergencies that didn't exist. Messages sent from smuggled phones that told stories about children with names borrowed from real charts. An orchestration of chaos meant to exhaust the one person whose exhaustion meant more than Cassandra's boredom. Security traced the theater and added new words to the case: telecommunications fraud. 3 months into incarceration, desperation tried one last costume: motherhood. Cassandra arrived at Eleanor's porch escorted by her parents and a priest with conscience on his face, claiming pregnancy with a gesture that had been rehearsed in mirrors and measured in mirrors and proven in none. Pregnancy is not a theory, and Eleanor moved to the truth like a surgeon to a tray, a test on the table, a timer on the armrest, a silence in which careers reconsider themselves. The negative result did not surprise anyone with a calculator. Denial tried Hail Marys and hormones and stress that manipulates biology on demand. The priest looked at the floor because priests have become familiar with that particular exploitation of faith. And Cassandra's father, once a judge, watched a lie collapse with a speed perhaps new to his docket. Then Eleanor delivered mercy's razor. Even if the test had been otherwise, circumstances made paternity anatomically impossible without interventions we had not pursued. Some lies do not die. They fold into others and travel on, but this one's bones snapped in the open where even the ocean paused. Cassandra's parents left with the posture of people who had finally met the consequences they had deferred for 28 years. Pity is a feeling we reserve for those who could not know better. Cassandra had always known better. She had simply chosen more. After the car left the gravel, Eleanor leaned back and closed her eyes in the filtered salt light. "Desperate people make predictable mistakes," she said, the line that would become a hinge in my memory because it unlatched the door between hurt and understanding. She squeezed my hand and let go, which is what love does when it trusts you have learned. Nor moved into Eleanor's guest wing months later, not because she needed protection, but because recovery prefers proximity to competence. She installed routines that outperformed prescriptions, walks timed by tide, speech practice measured in crosswords, meals that tasted like restraint and comfort at once. Our house changed climate, where Cassandra had chased status like a weather app for parties, nor built weather steady, breathable, with storms acknowledged and prepared for. Meanwhile, Cassandra accepted a plea because trials are better for the innocent than the exhausted. 18 months, probation, restitution, service at a clinic where the math of addiction faces the faces it destroys. There is justice in compelling someone to sit where their story began. Her parents sold Park Avenue and fled to Florida's anonymity, where reputation is something the ocean dissolves into foam for a fee. The philanthropic circuit, that carousel with better shoes, performed its own course correction. Her name left boards the way a stain leaves silk when someone knows the solvent. Plaques were edited like history always is, and auction audits repaired holes that had seemed like mysteries until greed supplied the pattern. Socialites learned again what they always forget: glamour without governance rots. Eleanor announced a gift that confused insiders until they heard the name: the Cassandra Sterling Memorial Fund for Gambling Harm Research, memorializing not a death but an illusion. She explained to a board with mixed sympathy that we were financing the end of the person I thought I loved, so fewer illusions would demand funerals in future. People applauded because even in rooms with silver, truth shines brightest when it holds a mirror without flinching. Power without warmth is cruelty. Warmth without power is sentiment. Eleanor had both, and in the months that followed, anyone who had doubted whether the so-called sheltered heir possessed a spine took notes they didn't admit taking. I assumed board chair duties with a policy pivot that read like restraint, but felt like rigor: transparent reconciliations, third-party audits, donor impact briefings that included outcomes and errors, because trust grows faster in the presence of admitted imperfection than in polished myth. The city noticed not because press releases asked it to, but because outcomes whispered. Pediatric wait times shortened where our equipment hummed. Families with burdens heavier than gossip found bills lighter than dread. And a quiet conversation spread that the Van Doren money had always been serious. Now it had also become specific. Specificity is how love behaves in public. It names, measures, adjusts, and returns next Tuesday. Nor and I avoided the romance that empathy sometimes counterfeits. Grief can make a person generous, and that generosity can be mistaken for love. So we waited longer than impatient hearts prefer, letting rituals prove themselves. Sunday flowers at Eleanor's elbow, Thursday reports read out loud so aphasia could be negotiated, Friday dinners cooked by Nor with spiced mercy. Love moved into the house like a permanent resident without ever slamming a door to announce its arrival. When engagement came, it was quiet and correct. A ring that did not brag, a vow that did not perform, a party on the terrace that included families whose children now raced on the lawn because their sternums had been opened and repaired by teams Nor trained. Eleanor stood with the recovered bracelet on her wrist and made a toast that ended with "build together." And for once even the Atlantic was polite enough to keep its applause to a murmur. Cassandra wrote from prison in handwriting so disciplined it must have been supervised by remorse or a counselor. She apologized with sentences that knew exactly what to say because the internet has taught sorrow its scripts. Nor read it and said gently that sincerity cannot be proved by calligraphy, and that manipulation often dresses as apology when leverage runs out. I filed the letter between the documents that began the case, not because it mattered, but because archives are where lessons are kept safe from revision. In quieter moments, I admitted what the city did not need to hear. I had loved the person I imagined Cassandra to be, the woman who would have taken Aliner's hand and learned her arithmetic, walked the hospital corridors and understood that philanthropy is not a photo but an outcome, and stood at my side preferring the difficult good to the easy grand. That person did not exist, and grieving a ghost demands a ritual without a grave, nor understood and refused to be a monument to my lesson, which is why we belong. Aliner's speech returned to near-perfect cadence, and with it her humor, sharper now, less performative, more surgical. She would tease Nor about overcooking fish and me about undersalting deals, and I would watch the two of them conspire to go on without me when necessary. Love arranges resilience this way, by making itself independent of the beloved's constant attendance. The board approved our largest single program, a citywide coalition integrating gambling harm treatment into primary care and pediatric social work, because children carry the debts of adults longer than creditors do. We named clinics after verbs, not donors: repair, return, restart, and Cassandra's fund became the engine of a future in which fewer people like her could hide between parties and pity. It is not revenge to prevent the next harm, it is duty. One afternoon on a bench outside the hospital, a woman whose husband had lost their mortgage to blackjack asked me why I had not destroyed Cassandra with the full weight of what I could command. I told her that courts and prisons had jurisdictions, and that my anger had borders where hers did not, and that boundaries had saved my life, and they might save hers if she redrew them with names like Never Again and Not for Sale. Nor listened and did not interrupt because doctors know the difference between advice and medicine. The latter must be requested. Cassandra's release approached, and with it a tremor in the gossip wires. Some wanted her back as a character because drama is a scarce resource in summer. Others wanted her hidden because shame disfigures mirrors. We ignored both camps and sent a letter through council with a single sentence. Restitution schedule confirmed, contact prohibited, treatment encouraged. Compassion is a policy when personal contact would be a relapse. Aliner asked me if I would ever forgive Cassandra, and I said I had already forgiven her as far as it touched my peace. Forgiveness is not reunion. It is the refusal to subsidize someone's power over your story any longer. Forgiveness became the unlocked door that still did not invite her in. It simply let fresh air pass through a house that had once held smoke. On our wedding day, Nor and I walked into a room not of donors but of outcomes. The first toast came from a boy whose chest bore a scar he called his lightning, and the second from a nurse who had seen too many funders evaluate impact by the weight of their step and repeat, and the third from Aliner who did not cry because that would have implied loss. Instead she said, "May your mercy be disciplined and your boundaries be kind," which is the texture of a life built to last. The winter after our marriage, the market did what markets do: it corrected, then overcorrected, and finally made sense. We built an endowment policy that insulated programs from mood swings, and I rearranged the board so that 2 chairs rotated under term limits harder than tradition preferred. Tradition forgives men who keep the chairs warm and punishes women who move them. Aliner bared her teeth and made sure the women moved them anyway. Nor published outcomes on integration of harm treatment in pediatrics, a paper dull to anyone who hasn't sat with a mother tallying debts next to oxygen saturation numbers, but thrilling to those who count lives and not likes. We hosted a convening where casinos sent representatives who spoke of entertainment with language even they couldn't keep a straight face for, and policymakers who finally said the word predation on stage without asking donors for permission to tell the truth. Truth invites enemies and good, both arrived on time. Cassandra's restitution checks began to arrive with a timeliness that suggested an officer's watchfulness more than contrition's calendar. We accepted them because restitution is not a feeling. It is a function. Those funds went straight into a program paying for emergency childcare when a parent was admitted to inpatient treatment, so they would not choose relapse over abandonment. A scandal ends when its lesson becomes someone else's safety. Her parents never returned to New York except as names on the underside of gossip. A judge without a courtroom is a citizen, and a mother without denial is a person. And Florida has a way of making both possible if one walks the shore early enough. Compassion does not require proximity, only the absence of contempt. At Christmas, we hosted families of the cardiac unit again. The bracelet on Alina's wrist caught tree light like old snow returning to remember things. Nor watched the children with the posture of someone who understands that miracle and protocol are cousins. I stood at the sink later and washed dishes with ridiculous joy, because sometimes happiness announces itself in the most domestic verbs. Cassandra's letter remained in the drawer next to the corkscrew, both tools for rituals that must be moderated. Once, in early spring, I saw Cassandra across Madison Avenue. She looked like a photograph printed on paper that had gotten wet and dried in a hurry, still there, edges soft, colors altered. She did not cross, and neither did I. Two people can carry a conversation's worth of history in one glance and decide independently to let silence complete it. I wished her a well-enforced boundary in my head and walked on, and it felt like closing a file for the last time. Alina died the following autumn with a ledger balanced in all the ways that matter. Accounts reconciled, enemies forgiven into distance, and the foundation entrusted to a team she had taught to prefer effect over applause. At the memorial, we did not tell the story of Cassandra by name because this is not her story. It is ours. And ours is the tale of what a family does when malice dresses up as love and asks for the keys. We spoke instead of weather, and of the house she built that could withstand it. After the service, Nor and I took the long way home along the river where the city pretends to be a town for a few blocks. She asked me what I missed most about the person I thought Cassandra was, and I said, the feeling that beautiful evenings would be more beautiful with photographs proving it. Nor nodded and said, then let's make evenings that do not require proof. We went home and cooked and ate and laughed, and none of it will ever be public, and all of it is real. In the end, Cassandra's first sentence at the gala had been half right in a way that made it entirely wrong. I did not know how to struggle because I had confused struggling with flailing. Struggle has direction and rules, and boundaries are its compass. When love returned, it came with a spine and a schedule and a willingness to be audited. The spoiled boy she mocked now keeps the books of his life with teeth, sharp enough to bite through lies, gentle enough to spare what deserves to last. If this is a redemption arc at all, it is not hers. It is the redemption of a legacy from the threat of softness that mistakes performance for virtue. It is the redemption of a man who believed that love without conditions is generosity, and learned that love with conditions is respect. And it is the redemption of charity from the gala into the clinic where outcomes tally like dawn, quietly, with light that doesn't ask to be thanked. The gilded mirror is still on our wall. It was my mother's, and then mine, and now ours. It used to show me the version of myself that rooms preferred and lovers shaped. Now it shows me a man and a woman and a house with weather worth living through. It reflects without flattery, which is to say it tells the truth, and in that glass my grandmother's eyes still measure and my wife's hands still work and my heart, finally, knows which audience matters. And on Sundays there are still flowers because rituals are not childish. They are constitutions. I place them by Alina's photograph, kiss Noor's temple, and drive to the hospital where the monitors hum a carol no gala can afford. Sentiment, it turns out, is not the opposite of strength. It's the memory that guides it home. It's the memory that guides it home.